Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Ellis here in Hurricane Alley in Philadelphia. You'll get it whacked on this one. Someone posted on my Facebook page about a blogger who has a PhD, and this blogger wrote a fairly long article, and by the time I saw it, it already had more than 500 comments on it. And a lot of praise, superb, other questions. The title of this was The Carbohydrate Hypothesis of Obesity, a Critical Examination. And the author really wanted to go after Gary Taubes and his argument that insulin is a primary cause of obesity. Now, I have a lot of reasons to go against Taubes. I think much of what he talks about is just simply incorrect. But I don't have any problems with the idea that insulin is involved in the cause of obesity. And this blogger ended his piece by stating that you get the page. Hang in there with me. Clearly, carbohydrate consumption per se is not behind the obesity epidemic. Now, as I've seen very often with PhDs and or other people who refer to the scientific literature, they get it all messed up. They don't read it correctly, they don't interpret it correctly, they don't understand it. And it was no exception here. So I just chose one small piece, one claim that was made, and got the reference for it just to see what it turned out. And the claim was that it turns out that insulin causes an increase in resting energy expenditure. And he gave the reference to it, and I went in there and got the reference, and it turns out, now he's going to, what he did from this point on, used this reference and made this point relative to the whole idea of people becoming obese in response to insulin exposure. And the argument he made was that insulin increased resting metabolic rate. So I got the paper, and it turns out this paper was a study done in sick people. It was done in diabetics. So to take the results of this study and extrapolate it to the whole population is unjustified. It's squirrely. And the results were not that much different. So you've got a sick population, and as we know in burn patients, their resting energy expenditure goes up. Well, in the analysis of this, they looked at the 3 different levels of people with glucose intolerance problems, and then, of course, diabetics as well, and they had differences in their fat-free masses and their body weights and their fat mass. And they did statistical analysis to see how all this accounted, and they made adjustments to it. And at the end of the day, they said that, yes, in frank diabetes, they do have an increased resting energy expenditure, but it only accounted for 81 calories a day. And then in another group, it accounted for 44, and the final group accounted for 53. Now, will those numbers of calories make a difference in body weight over time? Well, certainly in this population group it may, but there is absolutely no evidence, there's no published papers about insulin affecting resting energy expenditure in normal, healthy people. None. Zero. Doesn't exist. Yet this blogger with a PhD made an allegation, used it as part of his theoretical framework to argue that insulin is not involved in the obesity epidemic. Now, when they look statistically at all the different factors that accounted for the difference, the big ones were fat mass, fat-free mass. They accounted for 79% of the variation. And then there was a group of 4 other factors that accounted for about 3%. And of those 4 factors, insulin being one of them, insulin was a very minor factor. So to even implicate insulin in the change in resting energy expenditure in this group of sick people was a leap. Now, I could go through this whole paper of his and get all the individual scientific reports and show that the evidence that he's bringing to bear is problematic. It turns out that he's a neurobiologist, and he argues that the control of food intake resides in the brain. Well, this is not good biochemistry. We know that the control of food intake rests with what we call the metabolic control of food intake, and that is determined by whether food is stored or burnt. And this directly stimulates the liver, and the ATP levels, adenosine triphosphate, this is what dictates food intake, not something operating at the level of the brain. So there's another mistake he makes. And on it goes. He also was talking about the effect of different diet compositions on food intake and cited some papers. And I know that they fed these people different foods, high carbohydrate, high protein, high fat, and looked at their subsequent desire to eat, their hunger level. And it was shown in this one study after 24 hours that the high-fat diet did not satisfy hunger as well as the high-carb and high-protein. This makes the monumental mistake of not considering the antecedent diet. And as you all know, I have worked extensively to talk about adaptation to food and what you eat. We know that if we change your diet in 24 hours, you will not be able to burn fat. It won't happen because you don't have the enzymes to process it. You aren't adapted. That takes time. So you're going to get erroneous results. So the idea that hunger was higher on the high fat is explained by the idea that you can't burn your fat, so you can't suppress your hunger. But of course, this blogger, I'm sure, does not know that. He's only had his PhD since 2009, so I don't suspect he's had many years under his belt to read about research, whereas I've been reading about it since 1977. So these are some of the mistakes he made. Whether or not I'm going to go through this and look for more problems just to show where he's off, I might post some comments on his blog because there were some issues about where insulin resistance comes from. And we know where that comes from, but apparently, this was another PhD, did not know that work. He kept asking the question, where did the insulin resistance come from? And I might post a comment on that, explaining that, or I might put it on my own blog, or I might do another video on that. So this is what happens when these guys start blogging on this stuff and they represent themselves as a knowledgeable PhD and careful researcher. They're not careful researchers, and this guy was not careful at all and made misinterpretations, and the extrapolation to the population as a whole to prove his point that insulin is not involved in obesity is just absolutely absurd. So I wouldn't pay attention to this. But a lot of people in the comment section were praising him for his great effort. They obviously can't read anything either. So they don't know what to say about it. They just say, okay, this sounds great. This is wonderful. So that's the state of affairs in the blogger's world. I'm Dr. Greg Ellis. Stay out of the rain.